Imagine a world where you never have to worry about food, because it appears every morning without fail. You never fear predators, because none exist. Disease has been eliminated. The temperature is always perfect, and nothing can hurt you. But now imagine that this paradise kills everyone you know. In 1968, 8 mice were placed inside an enclosure measuring about 29 square feet, fitted with 256 nesting units arranged in 4-story apartment buildings. Everything a mouse could ever need was provided in unlimited quantities, and for a while, life was good. The population grew steadily, mothers built nests while fathers defended territories, and young mice grew up learning the rhythms of mouse society. By the second year, more than 2,200 mice lived in the enclosure, even though the habitat had room for nearly twice that number. However, that's when something went wrong. The society that had formed so naturally began to unravel, and within 5 years, every single mouse was dead. This is the Universe 25 experiment, and if you've already heard of it, almost everything you think you know is probably wrong. Politicians have cited it in Senate hearings as proof that overpopulation destroys societies. But in reality, the mice didn't die from overcrowding because the habitat never reached its capacity. And the scientist who designed this world and executed the experiment spent his final years frustrated that no one understood what he was actually trying to say. So what really happened inside those walls? To find that out, we need to go back decades before Universe 25 was built, to a young scientist watching rats in his backyard and noticing a pattern that would haunt his entire career. John Bumpus Calhoun was born in 1917 in a small town in Tennessee, and from an early age he was drawn to watching how animals lived together. He earned his doctorate in zoology from Northwestern University in 1943, and by 1947 he had begun his first experiments. In these experiments, he observed rats in outdoor enclosures while recording everything they did. But Calhoun wasn't interested in building better mousetraps or curing rodent diseases because he wanted to understand something far stranger. What happens to a society when survival becomes guaranteed? By 1954, Calhoun had joined the National Institute of Mental Health, where he would spend the next 3 decades designing increasingly elaborate rodent worlds. He wasn't a typical laboratory researcher focused on disease or genetics, however. His interests were philosophical as much as scientific, and he saw his mice and rats as windows into questions about existence itself. Calhoun believed that living creatures faced 2 different kinds of death. The first was death of the spirit, a collapse of meaning and purpose that hollowed out a creature from within. The second was death of the body, the physical end that everyone recognizes. Most scientists devoted their careers to studying the second kind, but Calhoun spent his entire life trying to understand the first. He was convinced that spiritual death always came before physical death and actually caused it. He built his thinking around 3 basic drives that he believed governed all of evolution: power, survival, and creativity. While most biologists focused on the first 2, Calhoun considered creativity the most important. He believed that the real purpose of life wasn't merely to survive, but to become something more than what came before. Evolution, in his view, was fundamentally about increasing awareness and capability, not just passing on genes. This might sound like the philosophy of a pessimist obsessed with extinction. However, Calhoun insisted throughout his career that he remained an optimist despite everything his experiments revealed. He called himself a revolutionist, combining the words revolutionary and evolutionist with the pharmacist's prescription symbol. That R wasn't decorative, because Calhoun saw himself as a doctor diagnosing a disease, not a prophet predicting inevitable doom. So Universe 25 wasn't meant as a warning that civilization was doomed. It was meant as a diagnosis, an attempt to identify precisely what conditions produce social collapse so that those conditions could be recognized and avoided. Calhoun wasn't trying to scare anyone, he was trying to write a prescription. But what disease was he trying to treat? To understand that, we need to watch the experiment from the very beginning. On July 9, 1968, Calhoun placed 4 male mice and 4 female mice into an enclosure he had spent years designing. The space measured about 2.7 square meters, roughly the size of a small bathroom, with 4 walls standing nearly 5 feet high. The mice could climb most of the way up, but the top section was smooth metal that was impossible to scale, so there was no escape from this perfect world. Inside, Calhoun had constructed what amounted to a mouse apartment complex. 16 identical buildings were arranged in a square, with 4 buildings on each side. Each building contained multiple levels of individual units, totaling 256 separate apartments that could each comfortably hold about 15 mice. To properly study overpopulation, as one account in The Guardian put it, Calhoun needed to be not just a scientist, but a rodent city planner. The resources were essentially unlimited because Calhoun wanted to eliminate every natural cause of death. Food hoppers could support over 9,000 mice, water bottles could serve more than 6,000, and nesting space could accommodate nearly 4,000. The temperature was controlled to perfection. There were no predators, and there was no disease. Everything a mouse could possibly need was provided in abundance. The 8 founding mice explored their new world cautiously at first, sniffing corners and climbing ramps until they understood the layout. They established territories, began breeding, and Calhoun recorded everything. The first phase lasted about 104 days. This was simply the adjustment period when the mice settled in, figured out where to sleep and eat, and established social hierarchies. The population grew slowly as the founders produced their first litters, and everything seemed to proceed according to plan. Then came the explosive growth phase, lasting from roughly day 104 to day 315. The colony came alive with new generations as the population doubled every 55 days. Young mice matured, found mates, and produced their own litters in an accelerating cascade of reproduction. The paradise appeared to be working exactly as designed. Food was plentiful, water was plentiful, and space was plentiful. An observer might have concluded that Calhoun had created rodent heaven. But around day 315, something changed that nobody could explain. The growth rate suddenly collapsed. Instead of doubling every 55 days, the population now took 145 days to double. Even though nothing physical had changed, the food hoppers were still full, the water bottles were still full, and most of the apartment units remained empty. Yet, the colony had begun to unravel. Territorial males started abandoning their posts for no apparent reason. Fights increased throughout the enclosure, but they weren't normal disputes over resources or mates. Some males became hyper-aggressive, attacking females, juveniles, and anyone who crossed their path. Meanwhile, other males withdrew completely, clustering together in the center of the enclosure, covered in wounds, passive and broken. The females retreated to the upper units, trying to escape the chaos consuming the floors below. Young mice were expelled from their nests before they had finished weaning. Wounded mice accumulated in corners, and corpses appeared with disturbing regularity. Then came the death phase. Beginning around day 560, the population peaked at roughly 2,200 mice and began an irreversible decline. But strangely, the violence actually decreased during this period, not because order had been restored, but because social behavior itself was disappearing entirely. The last birth occurred on March 1st, 1970, around day 600. After that, no new mice entered the colony. The existing population simply grew older one by one until they all died. The paradise had become a tomb. The popular explanation would become overcrowding, but that explanation had a fatal flaw. The standard story is simple. Too many mice crammed into too little space drove them mad. However, the numbers tell a completely different story. The population never came close to the physical limits of the environment. There was still room for nearly twice as many mice when everything fell apart. So the mice weren't destroyed by crowding, but by something else entirely. The problem was the design itself, because the paradise had been built in ways that made normal mouse life impossible. Consider how wild mice actually live in nature. Rodents build complex burrow systems with clear zoning. There are separate areas for nests, for food storage, and for escape routes leading in multiple directions. They mark territories with scent and defend them fiercely, and when populations grow too dense, subordinate animals simply leave to find new territory elsewhere. However, Universe 25 allowed none of this. The enclosure had 4 tunnels connecting the apartment stacks to the food and water at the center. These tunnels were about 34 inches long and only 3 inches wide. Every single mouse traveling to eat or drink had to pass through these choke points, creating forced encounters at exactly the worst locations. A mouse couldn't get food without potentially confronting every other hungry mouse at the same time. In the wild, a mouse who loses a fight can leave. It can find somewhere else to live, far away from the dominant males who defeated it. But in Universe 25, there was nowhere to go. The walls were too smooth to climb, and there was no outside world. The losers were permanently trapped with their tormentors. The environment was also strangely empty of anything to do. Apart from nesting material, there were no opportunities for activity, no obstacles to explore, no problems to solve, no challenges to overcome, nothing except eating, drinking, sleeping, and interacting with other mice. This meant social interaction was the only stimulation available. The mice had nothing to occupy themselves with except being around each other constantly, with no escape and no distraction. Wild mice establish territories with clear boundaries that other mice can recognize, but Universe 25 offered no way to establish those boundaries. There were no natural divisions, no way for a mouse to mark an area as its own and have that claim respected by the physical structure of the environment. The distinction between objective and subjective crowding matters here. Mathematically, 2,200 mice in 2.7 square meters sounds dense. But what actually determines stress isn't bodies per square meter. It's whether animals can retreat when they need to, and whether they can control their own social contact. Universe 25 provided none of this. The mice had everything they needed to survive physically, but the cage gave them no way to function socially. They weren't destroyed by paradise. They were destroyed by a paradise that gave them everything except the structures they needed to remain mice. But this raises another question. If the problem wasn't resources, what exactly did the mice run out of? If the problem wasn't overcrowding and it wasn't scarcity, then what actually caused the collapse? Calhoun provided the answer repeatedly, though it was largely ignored. He insisted that density itself was not the major factor. What mattered was the rate and quality of social interaction, which meant the crisis was social rather than physical. The mice ran out of meaningful roles long before they ran out of anything you could measure. During the explosive growth phase, young mice grew up in a functioning society. There were territorial males defending space and modeling what it meant to be a defender. There were females raising litters and demonstrating motherhood. Additionally, there were clear social positions to occupy and behaviors to learn. A young male could watch older males, learn how they defended territory, and eventually establish his own place. But as the colony filled up, something shifted. The established males didn't die the way they would have in nature, because the perfect environment kept them alive year after year. They held on to their territories indefinitely. Meanwhile, new mice kept being born into a world with no positions waiting for them. The young adults who matured during this period found themselves trapped. They had to remain in the colony because there was nowhere else to go, and they tried to compete for roles in an already filled system. But there were no roles left. Every position was taken by mice who showed no signs of dying or stepping aside. In the wild, this problem solves itself through immigration. Surplus individuals who find no place simply leave, seeking opportunity elsewhere. But in Universe 25, immigration was impossible. The young mice couldn't leave, couldn't establish new territory, and couldn't become anything other than surplus. The males who failed to secure roles withdrew physically and psychologically. They stopped trying to compete, stopped trying to mate, and stopped participating in mouse society at all. The violence that erupted wasn't about food or space, because there was actually plenty of both. It was about position and purpose. Young males attacked randomly because they had no role, no function, no reason to exist in a society that didn't need them. They weren't competing for resources and for the chance to matter. The hyper-aggressive males that terrified the colony weren't dominant animals at the top. They were failures who had lost every contest and had nowhere to go. They attacked randomly because random aggression was the only behavior left when all constructive paths had closed. This reframes everything about Universe 25. The experiment wasn't about what happens when there are too many mice. It was about what happens when there are too many mice and not enough meaningful things for those mice to do or become. But the collapse went deeper than failed males. Something was happening in the nests that would prove far more devastating. The popular story focuses on male violence and the strange withdrawn mice who appeared late in the experiment. But the collapse actually began somewhere else, in a place nobody was watching closely enough. It began with the mothers. The sequence is precise. First, territorial males gradually reduced how often they defended their space. They defended smaller areas over time, until eventually they defended almost nothing. This might have seemed minor, but it had devastating consequences. It left nursing females completely exposed. In normal conditions, a mother mouse with pups can rely on territorial males to keep strangers away. She can focus on nursing, on building nests, on the demanding work of raising young, because she knows her space is protected. But when that protection disappeared, mothers found themselves constantly interrupted by random mice wandering into their nesting areas. There was no peace anymore, no safety, and no predictability. The mothers adapted the only way they could. They became aggressive themselves, taking over the defensive role that males had abandoned. But this constant vigilance proved impossible to maintain with precision. The aggression that mothers developed to protect their nests eventually turned against their own young. Pups were attacked, wounded, and forced to leave home days before they would normally be ready to survive alone. But the mothers weren't cruel. They were overwhelmed by demands no mouse was designed to handle, while also nursing helpless pups. Constantly interrupted, constantly defending without help, they eventually lost the ability to distinguish between outside threats and their own offspring. Meanwhile, other aspects of reproduction were failing. Conception rates declined as stress disrupted mating. Many pregnancies ended before birth. Young mice were wounded during delivery as overwhelmed mothers made mistakes. Maternal behavior was disintegrating at every stage. By the middle of the stagnation phase, essentially all young mice were being prematurely rejected. They entered the world without the bonds and learned behaviors that would normally prepare them for adult life. In the most disrupted groups, infant mortality reached 96%. This is the hidden catastrophe that preceded everything visible. The violence everyone remembers was downstream from this moment. But the foundational collapse happened here, in the nests, when mothers lost the ability to raise their young. And here's the disturbing part. By the time anyone could see the decline, it was already too late. Calhoun calculated that the population was reproductively dead around day 700, even though mice were still alive and the colony still appeared to function. The social death happened before the physical death. The spirit died before the bodies followed. Even apparently healthy survivors couldn't recover. When researchers removed normal-looking mice and placed them in ideal conditions with plenty of space, they produced fewer offspring than expected, and none of those offspring survived to maturity. The damage was invisible, but total. By day 600, the population was already extinct in every way that mattered. The mice had lost the social skills required to mate and raise young. The last birth had already occurred. The colony looked sick to observers, but it was actually already gone. and the strangest symptom was yet to become famous. In the final phase, a new type of mouse appeared that looked completely different from anything Calhoun had seen before. He called them the beautiful ones. These mice stood out immediately. Their fur was pristine, sleek and glossy, without any mark or imperfection. They had no scars from fights, no wounds from conflicts, no signs of damage of any kind. In a colony filled with battered animals, they looked impossibly healthy. The name has become famous far beyond scientific circles. It has been cited in countless articles and videos as a warning about narcissism, about generations that choose grooming over responsibility, about what happens when comfort replaces challenge. The beautiful ones have become a symbol for everything people fear about modern life. But this reading completely inverts what Calhoun actually found. The truth is far sadder than the myth. The beautiful ones didn't choose withdrawal. They were incapable of anything else. They never approached females, never attempted courtship, and never tried to mate. They never fought with other males, never contested for territory. They never attempted any of the complex social behaviors that define mouse life. Their entire range had shrunk to eating, drinking, sleeping, and grooming, activities that required no social skill whatsoever. They weren't vain, they were empty. Their beauty was evidence of their brokenness. They were raised by overwhelmed mothers who rejected them prematurely in a colony where normal social behavior had already collapsed before they were old enough to observe it. Remember what happened during the stagnation phase. All young mice were being rejected before they were ready. They entered life without forming the bonds that would prepare them for adulthood. The beautiful ones were those rejected pups, grown older, but never grown up. Calhoun described them as capable only of the simplest behaviors needed for survival. They could eat when hungry, drink when thirsty, groom when uncomfortable. But complex behaviors like courtship and parenting required learning. It required watching other mice, practicing, failing, and trying again. However, the beautiful ones never had any of that. They were born into chaos and raised in abandonment. They never witnessed normal mating. They never saw territories defended. They never learned what it meant to be a mouse among mice. This was what Calhoun meant by death of the spirit. The popular interpretation treats the beautiful ones as a moral failing, as creatures who chose pleasure over purpose. But they didn't choose anything, because choice requires understanding alternatives they had never seen. They were developmentally broken in ways that couldn't be fixed. The chain of social learning had snapped, and once broken, it couldn't restart. Even when the population declined and space opened up, beautiful ones couldn't fill vacant roles. They didn't know how, and there was no one left to teach them. The species had forgotten how to be itself. But if this was what Calhoun discovered, why does everyone remember something different? Universe 25 arrived at exactly the right moment to become a legend. In 1968, the same year the experiment began, Paul Ehrlich published The Population Bomb. The book became a bestseller after Ehrlich appeared on The Tonight Show. Fears about overpopulation were suddenly everywhere. Cities were growing larger, the future seemed crowded and chaotic. Into this anxiety came Calhoun's mice, dying in their paradise, and the story proved irresistible. Media coverage was enormous. The New York Times, Washington Post, Time, Newsweek, and Der Spiegel all ran stories. In 1971, the U.S. Senate discussed the experiments and entered 3 of Calhoun's papers into the congressional record. The influence spread into popular culture. Tom Wolfe devoted pages of his book, The Pump House Gang, to Calhoun's behavioral sink concept. Mrs. Frisbee and the Rats of Nim appears to have originated from its author visiting Calhoun's lab. Even comic books absorbed the influence. One article compared Calhoun's recognition to that of Pavlov and Skinner. But today, psychology and biology textbooks contain virtually no mention of his work. Finding discussion of it in academic journals requires searching for historical critiques. The myth survived, but the science didn't. Why? Part of the answer is methodological. Universe 25 had no control groups, no comparison with different designs. The experiment continued to extinction without any intervention being tested. Genetic diversity was limited, leading to inbreeding over generations. The environment also created conditions that couldn't exist in nature. No emigration was possible, though emigration is exactly how real populations regulate themselves, and the space offered nothing to do except social interaction. Field studies never found anything like what Calhoun described. No wild population has ever shown behavioral sinks or beautiful ones. The phenomena existed only in the artificial laboratory. Psychologist Jonathan Friedman conducted human experiments in 1975, measuring stress and aggression under high density. He found no negative effects, directly contradicting predictions based on Calhoun's work. Calhoun contributed to the confusion himself. After his Royal Society paper, he rarely published in mainstream journals. Many later studies, including experiments on whether cooperation could prevent collapse, were never published at all. His vivid terminology hurt his reputation over time. Terms like beautiful ones and behavioral sink were perfect for magazines, but professionally unacceptable. Anthropomorphic language applied to rodents is now considered not just unprofessional, but dangerous to clear thinking. Calhoun spent years correcting misreadings of his own work. When critics suggested he was predicting human doom by 1984, he pushed back. That date wasn't a prediction of when humanity would collapse, he explained. It was a deadline beyond which the opportunity for thoughtful action might be lost. He wasn't predicting doom, he was urging intervention while intervention was still possible. But the myth was more compelling than the correction. A simple story about overcrowded mice going insane was easier to remember than a nuanced story about social roles and environmental design. The myth persists because it remains useful. It can argue against cities, against welfare, against modernity itself. It provides a dramatic narrative that feels true even when the science has crumbled. Universe 25 became a mirror in which everyone saw their own fears reflected back as scientific truth. Calhoun spent the rest of his career searching for answers. He ran experiments on cooperation and cultural learning. He envisioned global networks of human creativity. Most of that work was never published, and he died in 1995, largely forgotten by the scientific community he had once captivated. But the question he was asking, what do we become when there's nothing left to become, hasn't gone away. It may be more relevant now than when those 8 mice first entered their perfect world. Thank you for watching until the end. If you want to see more experiment documentaries, subscribe and watch this next video.